You're a young college student, unsure which path you want to go with your graduate studies. Then, an opportunity to interview clown suit wearing, scumbag serial killer John Wayne Gacy comes along, and you seize the opportunity, which ultimately turns into letters, prison visits, and even chats with other scumbags like Manson, Bundy, and several more. And what you eventually learn is that vicious killers all have one thing in common. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the true crime author of close to 50 books. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line. I think there are only a handful of true crime cases non-true crimers would recognize by a one-word name. Dahmer, Bundy, OJ, and Gacy, among a select few others. One reason is because of the brutality and depravity involved. We can't argue with that. Another is perhaps the way in which these cases have been sensationalized and pushed into the forefront of popular true crime culture. Yet, I think when it comes to John Wayne Gacy, especially, part of it is a matter of how friendly and seemingly harmless this monster appeared to certain people around him. And the fact that he worked as a clown and was around so many children. For the sake of those who don't know the basics of Gacy's reign of terror, John Wayne Gacy raped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men and boys in and around Norwood Park Township, just outside Chicago, Illinois, from 1972 to 1978, the year he was arrested. He became known as the Killer Clown due to his public performances as a clown, which immortalized him in a much creepier way and likely led to his popularity as one of America's most well-known serial killers. Gacy was born into a blue-collar family, and by most accounts, it has been said he had an ordinary childhood, though I bet that is an exaggeration at best. There's just no way a psychopath of Gacy's magnitude, especially when we take into account the sexual abuse element of his crimes, did not experience trauma of the worst kind as a child. Maybe I'm wrong. Over the years growing up, Gacy showed a growing tendency toward sadism, which resulted in several encounters with law enforcement during the 1960s. In 1968, after a conviction for sexually assaulting a teenage boy, he was confined to the Iowa State Men's Reformatory and forced to undergo several psychological evaluations. After his release in 1970, while still on parole, he was again arrested for sexual assault, but the charges were later dropped. Yes, dropped. Two-time violent offender of boys, and they drop the charges, creating an opportunity for him to go on to kill and then bury dozens of young male victims underneath a crawl space in his house. I don't want to get too deeply involved in the Gacy story. For one, it's just too vile. Secondly, he's had way too much press already. John Wayne Gacy is not the purpose of this episode, but it is important context for my guest this week, who spent some time interviewing Gacy. His name is Jeffrey Smalldon, and he has a brand new book just out, That Beast Was Not Me, One Forensic Psychologist, 5 Decades of Conversations with Killers. Hearing about this book, I thought my listeners would want to hear from a guy with such an extensive knowledge of not only the mind of the monster, but someone who had gotten down into the trenches with those monsters, meeting and interviewing them, which I can relate to, having interviewed Happy Face Killer Keith Hunter Jesperson for 12 years, receiving almost 10,000 pages of letters from him. As my good friend, Dr. Catherine Ramsland, says about Jeff's book, quote, "It's like being backstage to the killer's performances." That is so accurate, being that for the psychopath, truly, It's all about the performance. That mask of sanity they are experts at wearing in order to manipulate and ultimately violate. Jeff spent 25 years as a forensic psychologist, consulting on over 300 death penalty cases, along with thousands of additional criminal cases. What's interesting about Jeff's path into forensic psychology is the impetus.
My history of interest in violent criminals goes way back to before I became a forensic psychologist. My dad was an FBI agent, so there was a sort of constant hum of talk about crime, criminality, law enforcement in the house where I grew up. For whatever reason, I was a kid who was always interested in outsiders, outliers. But what changed was when I was a senior in college. I read Helter Skelter when it came out in 1974, and I had never paid much attention to the Manson case. But I read Helter Skelter in one caffeine-fueled all-night binge. And then my professor for a course in abnormal psychology mentioned in class one day that he had read it too. So we talked after class, and I said to him, I wonder whether some of those people who followed Manson became part of the Manson family and who came from middle-class families not like my own are a little more complicated than the media portrayals of them would suggest. And he said, well, why don't you write to them? That idea had never occurred to me, but I did it. I wrote Manson, I wrote Squeaky Frommie and her roommate Sandy Good, who were not in custody at the time. Anyway, my interest then was, to the extent I can get these people to reveal themselves in letters, will they match my stereotype of the people capable of doing the kinds of things that I knew that they had done or not? And if there was incongruity, then why? And, it was in that territory of possible incongruity that my interest was.
That correspondence, seemingly random, along with a blossoming interest in the mind of a psychopath, continued for several years. After writing, Jeff began to understand these people on a different level than any media platform could offer, or if he had simply read about them, and a passion for studying who they actually were and what made them tick grew.
So that correspondence continued for a couple of years, but I thought I was going to be an English professor. I went on and did a master's in English at Purdue, and I was thinking I was going to be a professor. But then I decided I didn't want to do that. So for utterly random reasons, I ended up at George Washington University, and I ended up of all the hospitals in the United States where I could have ended up for my one-year residency. I ended up at the largest private general hospital in Ohio, in Columbus. That's what brought me to Columbus in 1981.
A few years after being in Ohio during his residency as a budding psychologist, tragedy struck. There was a double murder, 2 women, inside the hospital, in the section Jeff was responsible for.
It was a little medical research lab with a single door that served as entrance and exit. Nobody saw anything unusual. Nobody saw anyone leave. Turned out the women had both been stabbed close to 30 times. One of them hogtied, one of them placed in a cold room that was used to store specimens. And nobody had any idea. I knew these women. I had been there for a Christmas party. This happened December 30th, 1983. And I had been there in the lab for a Christmas party right before I went home to my parents in Western New York for the holidays. And the police didn't arrest anyone for these murders. And nobody had a clue who would have wanted to kill these 2 women.
These brutal murders set Jeff on a different career path. He wanted to understand what happened, literally, right under his watch, inside the hospital at which he worked. What kind of person would commit this type of crime?
And so before too long, I thought, well, I was never cut out to be a businessman anyway. But this short-term experiment as a hospital administrator has come to an end. I'm dreading going to work every day. I thought I was interacting every day with the person who had committed the murders. I had my own hypothesis on who had done it, and I was having to interact with him every day. And I finally decided enough of this. I'm going to go to Ohio State and work toward my PhD in psychology with the goal of gaining a close vantage point from which to study the minds and motivations of killers.
So, What is it a guy like Jeff Smalldon, a forensic psychologist, thinks about a psychotic human being such as Charles Manson? Jeff spoke to Manson, exchanged letters with him, and his evaluation of Manson is unsurprising. Because when you come down to the nuts and bolts of dealing with these creatures who disguise themselves as human beings, they are all cowards and simpletons. It's their persona, which is generally built up by the media coverage, giving the public the wrong impression of them being some sort of super killer or evil genius.
I was concerned, kind of what you would predict, very erratic from letter to letter, day to day, sometimes sounded like a crazy person rambling. His letters were always written with the writing skills of someone with a fourth grade education. It was very frustrating to him to try and communicate his thoughts and ideas in writing because he couldn't do that very well.
There were some surprises, however, and those came from Manson disciple Lynette Alice Fromey, more widely known as Squeaky.
You know, I knew Squeaky Fromey at that point as Manson's most zealous disciple. She was Bulliosi Helter Skelter, and said she was his spokesperson since he was in prison. She was his second in command. So I kind of assumed that she would come across as this kind of wild woman. And she didn't. I remember the first letter I got from her was in an envelope with floral accents, large, neat, loopy handwriting, lots of talk of peace, love, flowers. I remember she said in her first letter, Charlie didn't do it, Jeff. He is it. He's the center of our world. He's the only one who can bring about world peace. And I'm thinking, world peace?
What is the old saying? Never meet your heroes? Well, I suppose that would fit within the public image we have of the monsters in society and the real world of getting in their face and speaking to them. They are not who we think they are. Let's take our first break here, and when we return, we'll get into Gacy and a few shocking stories from Jeff. Please subscribe to Crossing the Line wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to leave a review of the show, especially on Apple Podcasts. I'm doing this show independently now, free from any corporate or big podcasting media company involvement, which allows me to bring you more of the content you want to hear and have asked me for. This is completely our show. Reviews and subscriptions really help. You are my public relations and social media team now, and without your help, I could not do this. And that support, I must tell you, means everything. It's incredibly humbling. And I want to thank each one of you for listening. We can grow the show together, which will allow me to do even bigger things with it. If you go to crossingtheline.biz or mwilliamphelps.com, you can contact me there to suggest cases or just say hello. And look for me across all social media platforms at M. William Phelps. That's the @ symbol in my name, M. William Phelps. Be back in 1 minute. If I can just go back to what Dr. Catherine Ramsland said about the psychopaths Jeff Smalldon focuses on in his new book, That Beast Was Not Me. They are performers. The world is their stage. The people within that world, nothing more to them than players to do what they feel like doing with. This is the narcissist's way of stimulating him or herself. Make everything about them. Keep the focus on them. We, the sane people, are merely minions to maneuver around their rather large chessboards. And yet here's the thing. If you understand and realize this going in, you have outsmarted them on a core level and you maintain the upper hand.
What became very interesting is that after that first letter from Squeaky, her roommate and very close friend, Sandy Good, took over most of the correspondence. And progressively, and this is in 1975, Remember, Squeaky's attempt to assassinate President Ford occurred in September of that year. Sandy's letters, I remember one of her letters began with the words, "I never wanted to hear," from one of the Manson girls. It said, "Jeff, we're moving out of the realm of words." I thought, that's a bad sign. And she said, "It's time for action."
So that action she was referring to became an assassination attempt on President Gerald Ford, which went, how do I say this? Not at all as planned. On September 5th, 1975, Squeaky Fromy managed to get within an arm's length of President Ford on the public grounds of the California State Capitol building. She then pointed an M1911 pistol at him, but forgot to chamber a round in the weapon, which turned into a very unsuccessful attempt to fire, which led to her capture and arrest. As I have said many times on this show, these people try to make you think they're smart, but they certainly are not. And I think Jeff has pointed out rather clearly already multiple instances to show just how immature and stupid many of them actually are.
And in the very last letter I got 2 months before the assassination attempt, she said, "What I want you to do, Jeff, is go out in the woods, or maybe you can find one of your friends to do it, and kill a hunter, and then leave a sign on the trees saying, 'There are hunters hunting hunters.' And if people won't listen to you when you call and, convey this pro-environment message, tell them, remember Charles Manson, remember Sharon Tate. A wave of assassins will run through your homes and splash blood from room to room." Talked about people are going to get their arms chopped off. And I thought, okay.
That's some total Manson shit right there. So organically scripted from the Charlie Manson playbook.
Susan Atkins was another, she was the second most notorious member of the Manson family. Had made all kinds of extraordinarily provocative statements when she was being held in the Sybil Brand Institute in LA. So I wrote to her while my correspondence with Manson was ongoing, and she could not have been any more different than what I expected. By that time, she was claiming to have traded her allegiance to Charlie for an allegiance to God. So there was a lot of talk of the nullified past and Christ has forgiven her all her sins. And my inclination even then, and I was still very young, I was suspicious of all this conversion and God talk even then. But as far as I know, she maintained consistency in that for the rest of her life.
I asked Jeff about Gacy's undoing. What led to John Wayne Gacy's arrest?
Police really had no choice but to seriously investigate him in December of 1978 when his final victim, Rob Peast, disappeared at this incredibly brazen kidnapping, which just shows you the extent of Gacy's arrogance by that point. Gacy had gone to a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois, where he was going to do a remodeling project. He saw this young kid. The mother was moving back and forth between the inside of the pharmacy and her car. And Rob Peast went to his mother and said, "I'm just going to go talk to a guy for a minute about a summer job. He says he can pay me more than they're paying me at the pharmacy." And he was never seen or heard from again. And so the police began their investigation of Gacy. That was December 11th. And, eventually they discovered these bodies in his crawl space. They found 26 bodies in the crawl space under his house in this, it was Norwood Park, an unincorporated area near O'Hare Airport. 26 bodies under his house, 4 other bodies buried on the property, 4 additional ones in the Des Plaines River. So over the course, his first known murder occurred in 71, 72. He had been arrested in Waterloo, Iowa in 68 and charged with sodomy and sentenced to 10 years, but was released for good behavior after a little over a year. So his murders occurred between 71 and 78, with a dramatic escalation after 75, which is when he divorced his second wife. But all the time, and one of the things that makes the Gacy case so interesting to people is that very popular among his neighbors and hosted a big party in his backyard every summer. People couldn't believe that this was going on right under their noses.
What is it, I wondered, about the facade they are able to present so well in front of those closest to them? Knowing, of course, the easiest people to trick and lie to are those closest to us. Once you know someone's routine and interests and how they interact with others throughout their days, you can manipulate the situation to your advantage. And those people in your inner circle won't even notice unless you make a major mistake or tell a big lie. But others, on the outside, can of course see through it all more easily because they are not accustomed to all the small lies you tell to keep them satisfied.
Well, they work very hard at the performative aspects of looking like someone they're not. And Gacy took great pride in his ability to come across as a different kind of person than he is. I ended up visiting him twice on death row in Illinois, spending about 20 hours with him.
I wondered how Jeff felt going into that first meeting with someone who, by then, had become this kind of almost larger-than-life killer you'd not want to be a mile from for fear of that evil stirring in him rubbing off on you. How was it walking in and seeing Gacy for the first time?
Anxiety. By that time, I had been corresponding and occasionally talking with him on the phone for about 8 or 9 months in 1986. I was a graduate student at Ohio State. I had never before been in the same room with someone known to have committed murder, even one murder, let alone 33 like Gacy. So when I arrived there, I really didn't know what to expect, even though I knew from talking to Gacy on the phone, I learned some things about Gacy. I read everything that was available about his case up to that point, but I'd learned through his letters that he was very narcissistic. Everything was about Gacy. He could veer off of the Gacy train very briefly, but he always got back on board it within a minute or two. He would catch himself and say, "Oh, hey Jeff, how's school going? What kinds of courses are you taking?" And then he would be right back to himself.
Jeff could be describing any number of serial killers there, which is a point I try to make as much as I can. Most are alike, psychologically speaking. They very seldom differ from one to another. It's just who they are, and they cannot, despite how hard they try, hide it. I mentioned Happy Face Killer earlier in this episode, who I interviewed for a long time. He is identical to what Jeff describes about Gacy. They constantly, without even thinking about it, talk about themselves, even if they are trying to talk about a situation or someone else. Even when you bring up, say, a film or an item in the news about politics or sports, they wrestle that topic back to being about themselves. And when you mention this to them or call them out, they get a bit defensive, a little testy. So Jeff heads off to the prison, gets through the gates, and he is thinking about a few things as he makes his way toward meeting John Wayne Gacy in person.
Well, I want to see how he'll present in person. I've already discovered through his letters how prickly he is, which is a cardinal trait of narcissists, as you know. I'm sure they, in the face of a challenge, they get very testy very quickly. They just can't tolerate being questioned or challenged. And I already knew that about Gacy. So I was wondering, how am I going to handle this interview with him without really pissing him off? How well am I going to do at finding the balance between engaging him, developing some level of rapport enough so that I can have an interesting conversation with him, but not get him so up in arms over being criticized or challenged that he's going to basically bail out and say, I'm done, and get up and walk out. So that was the balance that I was looking to strike.
Psychopaths immediately get into it when you meet them in person. They always take the first shot, instantly trying to solidify their power and control. There's no small talk. How are you? How was your trip into the prison? Why? Because they don't give a shit. They only care about how they are going to play cat and mouse and manipulate you. You are there for them.
Interestingly, the very first time I went to see Gacy, and looking back, I think this is very typical, he greeted me by saying, I know you're looking for the monster. You think you're here to meet the monster, but you're going to meet the man. Even that, just referring to himself as the man.
But therein lies the danger. The absolute reason why psychopaths like Gacy, Bundy, and a host of others can kill so many.
I mean, he's very folksy. I remember after that first day with him, I called my wife and she said, well, what were your impressions? And I said, well, he's the kind of guy, if I went into a bar and sat down next to him at the bar, I would think he seemed totally unthreatening. We would talk about baseball, maybe get into politics a little bit. Pretty quickly, I would notice that he had no interest in my point of view at all, that it was all about Gacy. But he had mastered that faux folksy presentation, which is what made him such a lethal predator, of course, because he was able to disarm his victims. And Gacy famously tricked them into participating in the handcuff trick or the rope trick. And they did it, usually plied with some alcohol before they actually did it. But he was very, very good at that.
And I can relate, because oftentimes when you meet these people in prison, it's not a scene out of a Hollywood film with some NFL linebacker type guard the size of a house standing behind you, arms folded, ready to pounce if your psychopath decides to do something. Most of the time, you are on your own. I can recall sitting 2 feet in front of Happy Face, a guy himself who was in the 6'7" tall range, about 350 pounds, his hands the size of catcher's mitts, hands of which strangled 8 women just a foot from my own neck. And you cannot, no matter what, express any fear, any sign of intimidation, or they've already beaten you at this game you've entered into. And it is a game.
There was nobody else in the death row visiting room. And he said, you're going to meet with Gacy in the first room on the right, but I want you to know that there aren't going to be any prison personnel back there with you. There'll be a video camera on the wall, but there won't be any guards back there. And he said, if something should go awry, or if, God forbid, a hostage situation should develop, you're going to be on your own. It's our policy not to negotiate with inmates. And I remember thinking, really? Okay, well, that's not what I expected. And I lost my concentration. One of the questions I meant to ask the guard was, is there a restroom back there? And I forgot about it. So 3 hours into my conversation with Gacy, what had begun as a mild urge to pee had become something much more dramatic. And I finally said, John, I really hate to have to ask you this, but is there a restroom back here? And he says, hell no. Are you kidding me? He says, you're going to have to go out to that gate and yell for the guard's attention, but don't expect them to respond because, and all kinds of obscenity. He loved to talk down the guards. And he said, those fuckers aren't going to respond to you. They're off playing poker somewhere. So sure enough, I went out there and yelled and then yelled louder. No response at all. So I sheepishly go back to the room where Gacy is smiling, loving my predicament. Like you said, loving the sense of control and vulnerability. I'm an idiot. He knows it. I know it. And he says, no, I said yell. If you really want to get their attention, you're going to have to yell. So I ended up going back again and yelling as loudly as I could and finally getting a guard's attention and thinking, this is a bizarre situation. I'm back here behind this locked gate with one of the most infamous predators in modern history, and I can't get anyone to respond to take me out to use the restroom. Gacy's amusement at my plight spoke volume.
On that joyful note, let's take our final break here. And look, I know ads and commercials can suck, but truly, they are what pay for this show. And so please listen to them. And if you feel like a product or service is something you want, absolutely make the purchase and tell them you heard the ad on Crossing the Line with M. William Phelps. I would really appreciate that. Be right back. I always ask any forensic psychologist I speak to talk about the differences between a psychopath and sociopath, only because the two terms are so interchangeably tossed around on true crime television and in the news media. People just throw these two terms around like they mean the same thing, and they don't. There are clinically marked differences. We need to get this right on TV and when we discuss these people. And it's not freaking too hard to do. So, of course, it enrages me that people are so damn lazy in this field and fail to educate true crimers correctly.
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of confusion about that. And part of it is caused by the fact that in the DSM manual that mental health professionals use to diagnose people, under the thing that is closest to psychopath, which is antisocial personality disorder, the text makes it sound like they're basically the same thing. It says, a lot of people refer to antisocial personality disorder as psychopathy or sociopathy when they're very different. Robert Hare, who's probably the world's foremost authority on psychopathy, says, we both underestimate and overestimate how many psychopaths there are among us. We underestimate it because they're embedded in our government and in our corporations. They're not all criminals, but they're taking advantage of people. They're predatory. They're exploitative. But we also, real psychopaths are much, much more infrequent than antisocial personality disorder. A true psychopath, is not the reactive, impulsive, emotional person like a sociopath might be. A psychopath is usually very organized, very, very well camouflaged, very deliberate in the steps that they take to violate the rights of other people and to get what they want. They're utterly callous. They don't have, they're not conflicted about what they do at all. They don't experience dissonance as a result of their predatory behavior.
Here's an easy way to tell the difference between the two. You're at a party, there's a guy, and it's generally always a guy, talking himself up, bragging, not paying any mind to anyone else or their interests. And he is challenged, and he gets pissed off. This guy might fly off the handle in front of everyone, maybe throw a chair, punch someone, tell everyone to fuck off, and not leave until he is ready. That could be a sociopath. Now, at the same party, there's another guy who feels the same, as if he's been slighted and someone there, maybe several, enraged him, just hit at the core of what truly triggers this guy. That guy won't likely say or do anything, and he'll leave without incident. And yet, he will walk out the door and then go around the back and burn the fucking place down with everyone inside. That would be the psychopath. So you see, there are major differences here. One runs on emotion, the sociopath. The other, not so much. We've all come across sociopaths in our lives. Some of us have interacted without knowing with psychopaths. But the psychopath, I want to point out, is very rare. The American Psychological Association suggests that severe psychopathy affects just about 1% of people, and yet some of its research tells them that close to 30% of us have some psychopathic traits. But please understand that number. 30% of the population display some level of psychopathic traits. That list of traits, which Dr. Robert Hare designed, can be found online. Google the 20 characteristics of the psychopath and you'll see it. Just make sure it's Dr. Hare's list. He authored it and is the authority. And just because you might have a few yourself doesn't make you any different from most people. The psychopath, I need to point out, is a very rare human being. Here's Jeff talking about how the psychopath displays some of those traits I just mentioned. You spend 6 hours with John Wayne Gacy, I think one of the world's most noted psychopaths, You learn a few things about how they present themselves.
Gacy could lie all day, and you never see any sign of dissonance on his part from telling these lies. He's very controlled, can sort of talk his way around or out of pretty much any corner that he is backed into. I would challenge him on some things and say, you confess to these killings, right? Like you confess not only to the police multiple times, but you confess to your attorney. And he'd say, there you go with all your speculation and your fantasies, Jeff. You're smarter than that. And all of a sudden, he would be back to talking about how absolutely impossible it was for him to have been the one who placed all of those bodies in his crawl space. So he takes control of the conversation again.
I think we all get the picture of who these monsters among us are in the real world. Jeff does a great job of bringing it all back to the sheer power and control aspect of their personalities and how they like to dominate even a conversation about a baseball game or a meal. Or, in Jeff's case, going to the toilet. That's about all the time I have for this week. Be back next week with a new episode. Remember, I need your help. Please subscribe to Crossing the Line wherever you get your podcast. And don't forget, leave a review of the show, especially on Apple Podcasts. And log on to crossingtheline.biz or mwilliamphelps.com to contact me and suggest cases or just say hi. And look for me across all social media platforms using the @ symbol and my name, M. William Phelps. Thank you for supporting this show. I am allowed to do it because of you, and that truly means more to me than I can say. Be safe, be aware. The one source I use beyond Jeff Smalldon's book, That Beast Was Not Me, is Philip J. Jenkins' John Wayne Gacy, Encyclopedia Britannica, June 17th, 2024. CTL is produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, written and executive produced by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.